Hey, hello, happy Friday. As you saw, today we are discussing Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas, which is the sophomore follow-up to last year's The Hacienda. Now, I really enjoyed last year's The Hacienda, but I also had some criticisms and critiques, particularly around how the relationship was handled in that book. If you are interested in expanded thoughts, please feel free to check out my feature Friday for The Hacienda. So I was very excited to pick up Vampires of El Norte, especially because we were moving on from like a gothic romance, which I love, to something that has, presumably, according to the title, vampires in it. However, the vampires in this operated much differently than I initially anticipated. So I was very excited to be surprised by this novel. And while I again have a few criticisms and critiques, which we will go over, I thought that this was a really excellent sophomore novel. And I really like the focus of the writing, the direction Cañas seems to be going in with her work, because it's filling this niche that I really enjoy and haven't really gotten to read in a whole lot lately, that is historical fiction, supernatural, and romance, all things that I absolutely love. Additionally, I think her voice is further establishing itself here, and I really am enjoying that voice. So all that being said, what exactly is this book about? Well, it follows our two protagonists, Nena and Nestor, who are childhood friends. We pick up in the narrative when they are 13, and they have this intense bond. Nena is the daughter of the head of the hacienda, the ranch, and so there is this power dynamic at play between her and Nestor, who works and lives on the ranch with his family, and they had actually come when Nestor was young, after their previous home had been attacked, because this novel takes place around 1846 when the United States invades Mexico. And so it's definitely exploring those tensions prior to that invasion and how it impacted those people living in El Norte. And so these two are incredibly close despite this class difference between them, and the fact that Nena's mother has really been kind of trying to rein her in, especially as they're 13. They're starting to look toward political matchups, especially in terms of marrying her off to another wealthy owner of a hacienda in order to try and secure an alliance, as they're seeing this need to kind of strengthen their territory and their alliances as there is this attempt to steal this land. And so these are the plans for Nena, but Nena has other plans. She really enjoys Nestor. They are incredibly close. And so despite being told not to hang out with him, Nena sneaks out after hours, and they are determined to go and find some buried Spanish treasure. Because Nestor has been hearing stories. I believe he started to go out with the vaqueros around this time. He will become a vaquero later. And so they've been told these stories and they are enchanted by them. And they see this as a means to build a future if they can find this treasure. And there is this idea that if a light is hovering out in the darkness, it is indicative of this buried treasure. And so they go out into this dark expanse. And that is one of the things I really enjoyed about this book, because it does cover this dark expanse and create this dark expanse, and also just the vastness that it establishes in the narrative. You can feel the land here, and there is definitely a connection to the land, and it's very much a Western in theory in some ways because of this connection to the land. And you might be saying, Melody, you don't like Westerns, because that has been something I've traditionally drawn a pretty firm line with not liking on, and this again is the exception to the rule. It feels like I'm only ever coming on with the exceptions, which I think is a pretty good thing all considered, because that means I'm enjoying what I'm reading. And so here we're presenting this conflict and this thematic exploration that is more than just like man conquers the land, and so I think that that is definitely part of it. There is definitely this much deeper connection, and Nena's connection to her home, Los Huelos, most specifically, which we will swing back to. So they go out into this vastness, and they are in this empty, dark space when a wild thing, a monster, attacks, and it attacks Nena, and Nestor is too late in his reaction to help her. And so he is forced to watch his closest companion kind of mauled by this monster. I think you can guess what kind of monster. I'll let you put those pieces together. And so he is distraught. He takes her back to the house. He is cradling her silent, collapsed form as she is bleeding out. And so when he takes her to the house and Nana's mother is wailing and says she's dead, he panics and he runs because he thinks that his best friend is dead. And so we pick back up then from this 9 years later. Nestor has been haunted by this for almost a decade, and we see how this has informed his kind of more transient lifestyle, in the sense that he has been living this life of a vaquero. He hasn't been settling down in one place and creating a home in one place since. He is still dreaming of the home that he was planning to create with Nana, this kind of wild dream they had as children, this dream he had that he was gonna buy some land and he was gonna create this future, and he wasn't going to be dependent on this person, Nana's father in this instance, for this power over him. And so he has created this independent life for himself. Meanwhile, spoiler alert, Nana did not die. Now, you might be thinking, as I admittedly was, okay, she's definitely a vampire, especially with the way in the title, vampire is so evident and so prominent, and because we are expecting, or I think a lot of readers are expecting with this title, this romance at the center, I think we're perfectly primed to have one of our leads be a vampire. And that is not what we get. And I think for some readers, this may be a stumbling block because the exploration of vampires in the book may not be what you were expecting. But I was really intrigued by this, and I actually thought it was a really interesting choice. I don't know that it always 100% succeeded. I think that there was a little bit more maneuvering there that I would have liked to see, but I did like it. So we are returning to this Nana who is alive. She has not been given any kind of vampire powers by this bite. I would have been interested in exploring the kind of mechanics of the vampire bite a little bit more, the rules of it, because according to the narrative as it's established, we get a couple of things. They're being kind of hit with this sickness. I think it's called susto. And it's this kind of like lack of energy, this trance-like thing that Nana is having to call people back from. And she is basically training under Abuela to become a healer. And she's seeing this as her way to establish a place that isn't dependent on her marrying off to someone else and leaving her home. And so she is really struck by this idea. And so she's working to battle this illness as it's appearing. And this is one of the symptoms of the vampires. The other thing that becomes evident as a symptom is that she kind of almost has this like sixth sense that develops over being able to kind of sense when they were near, presumably from being a survivor. And so when we pick back up, we get this kind of slow building kind of ominousness. We don't necessarily have this sense that the vampires are lurking in the shadows again right away. Instead, our more clear and present danger is Texas invading this territory and trying to steal this land from these landowners. And so they are working to consolidate their power in this way because the Mexican government isn't really sending them aid and support in this. And I want to make clear that I am not an expert at all in this kind of historical conflict, in this time in history, in this place in history, which is part of why I absolutely loved this book. I loved the historical setting. I loved the specificity of the place it created. I loved the emotion of the place it created. It drew such clear pictures. And I love that the voice really supported this historical fiction bend. It really let us get lost in the atmosphere in some ways. Now, this also means that the tone and the voice is a little bit slower paced than some may be expecting, especially from like a horror romance, but this is very much also an angsty, slow build, and the slow build of the tension and the danger is part of that. Now, do I think the pacing of this is always perfect? No, and I think that that really kind of breaks down in the middle third a little bit and could be consolidated, and we'll explore that a little bit more in depth here in a second. So basically, they are attacked. They have to put together this group to ride out and protect their home. And in the process of this, one, Nana convinces her father to let her ride out with these men as a healer. And two, Nana's brother, who we find out has been in contact with Nestor this whole time, calls him home to basically serve in place of some of his family that shouldn't be riding out for protection. So he is basically coming back to take the place of one of his family members. And in the process, learns that Nena is not dead. Now, it is kind of unclear. I think there was a duality here. One, I think Nestor, especially in these letters, was really avoiding all reference and mention of Nena because he didn't want to be reminded of that heartbreak. But I also think that Nena's brother was very specifically not mentioning her because he also knew how close they were, and this tension of their closeness and trying not to rekindle that from her family becomes one of the major tensions in the book. And so I think that there was a little duality there because initially I was like, are you kidding me? He's been writing to them this whole time. Like, why didn't he know? This feels like a little bit of a stretch. But the more I sat with it, I was like, this makes sense. So he comes back, sees that she is not dead, but unsurprisingly, she's not super happy that he has abandoned her basically for 9 years and isn't at all interested in talking to him. Now, this makes sense at first. That bitterness, that anger, especially when considering how isolated she's felt in the years after, how she has basically lost her person that she could be the most free with. And we see her as this very restrained young woman when we pick back up with her. She has the weight of a lot of expectation on her from her mother, from her father, from her brother, trying to lead by example for her little sister. So there is a lot going on. However, she continues to be bitter and angry with him as they ride out, as they are attacked, as they separate after this attack to try and go back to Los Pueblos and kind of warn everyone, and not only about the Texas Rangers that are attacking, but about the vampires, because this is where the vampires come back into play. And it's kind of a slow build for them, as it's a slow build for this relationship. I think the middle section is where we could have seen the most consolidation, because while I appreciated the angstiness and the slow burn, and while that solved a lot of problems in terms of like relationship development that I had with the first book, because I was so on board with the romance in the hacienda, but everything moved just a little too quickly and too easily for me, and it didn't feel like there was that real romantic connection that had developed organically. Rather, it felt like I was being told that connection existed. Here, I felt that connection. We had this whole section at the front that really established the closeness, the bond of these two, and so I was completely on board. However, when we kept going through these similar beats in terms of their relationship, where it felt like we'd make some headway into them seeing the other's point of view, most specifically Nena seeing Nestor's point of view, although Nestor also had to get over some things in terms of realizing that Nena has also been through some things and that he has held on to this kind of idealized form of her and has built her up in a way in his memory and his mind in connection with this really traumatic event in his past in a way that isn't fair to her, and that she has other obligations and responsibilities now that she also has to consider. So there is that duality, although I really would have liked to explore that from Nestor a little bit more and get into that a little bit more specifically. We touch on it a little bit later, but not as completely as I think we could. So rather it feels like we're going through a lot of beats in their relationship of her just being angry with him and icing him out, which is justified, but there isn't necessarily action that changes the tenor of those beats, and so they feel similar. It feels like they're accomplishing similar character work and plot progression, and we're just going over them again and again as if it's new action, and I think that there was an opportunity to introduce new action there that took away from, and so I think we could have navigated that a little bit differently and still drawn out that kind of angst, that realization that they are different people and having to learn who this new person is, appreciating this new person for who they are while still holding on to the love of the person that existed before, because I do think that that is incredibly important, and I think that that's what this was attempting to do. This whole journey between the two of them was a chance to get them alone and isolated and have this kind of intense experience together. However, Nena's refusal to kind of hear Nestor out starts to feel really obstinate. She starts to feel a little whiny because of that, and I don't really feel like that's a fair assessment necessarily, but that's how it starts to read, and it just doesn't feel rooted necessarily in her character. She kind of goes back again and again because we are seeing this in a dual POV, which I really love, as you know, and it is third person, which I also love, and so we're seeing her be disappointed by this distance of 9 years, this idea that he stayed away for 9 years, but then she is also not interested in hearing answers in a way that I personally read her as more inquisitive than that. And so she'll kind of like open up the doorway to the answer and then shut it down in a way that I feel like she, even if she was shutting that door, even if she was setting a boundary, she may have been more interested in hearing the why behind it. Now, that may just be my interpretation of the character. That is not your interpretation of the character. But ultimately, I felt like there was some space here that while I appreciated the character work and the development of their relationship, I liked spending time with them, it started to feel a little frustrating because it didn't feel like we were getting anywhere new. And I think that that space could have been used differently. It could have been used to kind of establish Naina's relationship with her brother outside of her kind of using him to maneuver with her parents to kind of gain a foothold with her father in particular. And so then when he makes a choice, her brother, later in the narrative, that kind of hurts her, that feels a little bit heavier because then they have this relationship that's independent of what he can do for her. It makes sense that that's kind of the transactional relationship that they would have, but I feel like that would have been a really interesting use of time. Additionally, I think we could have established the lore around the vampires a little bit more because I did like that they were monsters, and I liked it even more when that idea of them being monsters was challenged because I thought that was doing something incredibly interesting, and I thought there was a lot that was really intriguing going on in the last third of this book that I think that if we had kind of condensed again that middle third, it would have given a lot of that more room to breathe. And again, I understand that we needed that time alone with Naina and Nestor in particular, because this is a romance-forward story, so we need to develop that romance, though it is fade to black if that matters to you. So we needed that time between the two of them, but again, maybe even if we just switched up some of how they interacted with each other, some of those beats being so similar between them may have made that feel a little bit more intentional and a little bit more active, so that then the last third of the book didn't necessarily seem like it was a narrative rush, especially because there were such interesting explorations of how monsters are conceived, the idea of home, the idea of class differences and the making of a person, the ideas of enemies within this conflict, and greed and colonization, and the kind of multifaceted exploration of colonization. I really appreciated the historical details here, like I said, and I think that those were really evident in the story, and I think that there was so much groundwork that was laid in terms of creating place that it really carried a lot of the narrative historically in terms of creating that place and feel and tone in a way that was kind of invisible, which is the point. And I think that it expertly succeeded in that because then we were able to see how the place and time impacted our characters, how it acted on our characters, and how our characters were forced to act within their circumstances. So again, while we get the vampires that we were pretty much promised right on the front, I mean, if there were no vampires at all, I think that that would have been a little misleading, a little false advertising. We definitely get different vampires, I think, that most of us went in expecting, but I was very intrigued by this portrayal. Again, I would have liked to see the kind of lore and ideas around these vampires kind of expanded just a little bit more. But like I said, I also liked the way that they kind of snuck in. There was this kind of building tension, sense of doom. We presented these like very monstrous, looming creatures, and then we also complicated that. And so I think that there was a lot going on there, and I would have liked to see it drawn out even just a little bit more. Now, in terms of Naina and Nestor, even with this a little bit draggy middle, I really enjoyed their romance. I thought that it was rooted in something that made sense in terms of their connection as children, and then they both kind of had to overcome this idealization that they had built up for the other after this relationship and after they were kind of traumatically separated in a way. And so there is this deep connection, but they're also rediscovering each other as new people, like I said. And so there is this tension that makes sense. It's just where we repeated similar veins of that tension that became a little bit distracting in the middle. But I really liked how it explored the realities of the roadblocks in terms of their relationship. We saw these very real outside obstacles, and we also saw how they as characters were reacting in face of these outside obstacles, and how different reactions, especially particularly from someone like Naina, who may not be as idealistic or responding as idealistic as Nestor might or expects, because she has been tempered by a lot of reality and has had to adjust herself and her wants and desires and has to kind of temper them and know how to ask for what she wants in very specific ways and kind of bow to the whims of particularly her father. And so this is a reality for her that she has to overcome, but also getting Nestor to see what her reality looks like, and her in return seeing what Nestor's reality looks like. And so overcoming that and growing together as all good relationships do. And so, like I've also said a couple of times, I really enjoyed the historical backdrop here. I enjoyed the historical backdrop in the hacienda, and I think that what was so notable for me here is that by all accounts, because we spend so much time kind of in this vast expanse, I shouldn't be as drawn to this as I was. And so I think it really shows how compelling it makes this history, but also just how much I'm craving different historical settings and perspectives, especially when you sprinkle in the romance and the supernatural. And the supernatural is an excellent enhancer for the historical themes and explorations that are at play. I think this was an incredibly strong sophomore novel, especially after something like The Hacienda. And most importantly, I think it really establishes that I am incredibly interested in watching where Cañas's voice continues to go. So if you've read this, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts. Feel free to leave those below. As always, thank you for hanging out and listening to mine. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. It is incredibly helpful, but most importantly, read something good, and yeah, bye.